The clock struck 12. As the last chime rang through the hall, there was a sharp, horrified gasp from Veronica Hargrave. She had been standing beside the grand clock, an antique piece inherited from her father, when her expression faltered. Her eyes widened in fear, and then, as if in slow motion, she took a step back. The others turned towards her, their curiosity piqued, but it was too late. The great clockmaker had collapsed. Samuel Hargrave, the man whose every creation had been defined by his meticulousness, lay motionless on the polished wood floor, a thin stream of blood trickling from his mouth. The room fell into chaos. Veronica screamed. The historian Forsyth rushed forward, his hands trembling, while Tommy Hayes stood frozen, his face pale. The financier, Martin Blake, was the first to recover his composure, though his expression was one of deep concern. "What happened?" Veronica cried. "Is he?" Her voice trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "He is dead," Forsyth stated bluntly, though the words did little to calm anyone. "How?" Tommy stammered, his eyes darting about the room. "How could this have happened? We were all here, watching." "I do not believe this is an accident," Blake said, his voice steady. "This was no natural cause." As the servants rushed to summon the local constable, Poirot's name surfaced. Someone had heard that the famous Belgian detective was staying nearby, and with that, they had a glimmer of hope that someone with a keen mind and a sharp eye, might be able to uncover the truth. Chapter 3. The Arrival. Hercule Poirot arrived at Dunsford House on the afternoon train from London. He was greeted by a flurry of servants, one of whom informed him of the tragic events that had transpired earlier that day. Poirot listened carefully, his piercing eyes taking in the details as they led him up the drive and into the grand manor. The house was eerily silent now, save for the hushed whispers of the guests and servants alike. It was clear that something sinister had occurred here, but what? Poirot's mind was already working, dissecting the few clues he had been given over the brief exchange with the housekeeper. "The clockmaker is dead," he said, his voice low but precise. "An unfortunate event indeed. But I must remind you, my friends, that the time for grief will come later. Now, it is the time for me to work." Inside the drawing room, Poirot's eyes scanned the surroundings, the overturned chair, the delicate ticking of the other clocks, the faces of the suspects, all strung together by a tight web of unspoken emotions. He could already sense that each one of these people was hiding something, and he would uncover it in due time. "Well, mon ami," Poirot said to the constable, his tone measured, "we must begin. The crime must be explained, and I shall be the one to explain it." The game was afoot, and with Poirot's meticulous mind at the center of it, the mystery of the clockmaker's final hour would soon begin to unravel, but only after the smallest, most crucial details had been observed, its chimes echoing throughout the damp, still air of Dunsford House. The manor sat like a monolith against the darkening sky, a relic of the past untouched by the modern world. Built centuries ago, it seemed to grow out of the very earth itself, solid, impenetrable, and full of secrets. The ivy that clung to its gray stone walls gave it an almost ancient look, as though it had weathered centuries of storm and sun, growing more entwined with time itself. Samuel Hargrave, the renowned clockmaker and owner of Dunsford House, had spent most of his life inside these walls, surrounded by clocks, ticking, talking, whirring, and chiming. He was a man of precision, of unyielding control, and his creations were a testament to his genius. His clocks, though few in number, were regarded by the finest collectors in Europe. It was said that to possess a Hargrave timepiece was to possess a fragment of perfection. But on this particular morning, the manor, though alive with activity, was shrouded in a quiet sense of tension. It was not just the looming clouds overhead or the brisk wind that rattled the windows. There was an undercurrent among the guests that made the air heavy, thick with unspoken words and private thoughts. The guests had gathered in the grand drawing room, waiting with various degrees of impatience for the moment that Samuel Hargrave had promised would be monumental. He had invited them for a special unveiling, something no one had ever seen before, something that had never been attempted in the world of horology. Among the gathering were Martin Blake, a successful financier whose wealth seemed as boundless as his charm. He was dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, his dark eyes constantly scanning the room as though calculating the worth of every person present. There was Veronica Hargrave, Samuel's niece, a strikingly beautiful woman in her early 30s, whose pale complexion contrasted sharply with her fiery red hair. She had recently returned from Paris, and there was something about her presence that seemed both fragile and guarded. Edward Forsyth, a local historian and an expert in the manor's storied past, was also in attendance. His obsession with the house's history was well known, and his eyes seemed to dart nervously from one piece of furniture to another, as though the house itself held secrets he was desperate to uncover. And then there was Tommy Hayes, Samuel's assistant, a jovial and outwardly good-natured man with a quiet loyalty to his employer that bordered on reverence. His hands were often fidgeting, and though he wore a forced smile, his eyes betrayed a deeper concern. Samuel Hargrave himself had not yet arrived, but the guests, though eager, were clearly uncomfortable. They spoke in whispers, glancing at the large, ornately carved clock in the corner of the room. Its face gleamed with gold filigree, and the second hand ticked away relentlessly, marking time that felt far too slow. It was, as always, a reminder of Hargrave's obsession with precision. Even in his guests' discomfort, time would not be rushed. At precisely 10:50 a.m., the door to the drawing room creaked open. Samuel Hargrave entered, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. He was a tall man, with sharply defined features and a meticulous appearance. His suit was perfectly cut, his silver hair combed back with the precision of a man who viewed every detail with great importance. His dark eyes, though sharp, held a glimmer of something deeper, something unreadable, something unsettling. "Good morning, my friends," he said, his voice rich with authority and control. "It is a pleasure to welcome you to Dunsford House on this most significant of occasions. Today, I present to you a creation that will change the very nature of timekeeping. A masterpiece." He paused, allowing his words to hang in the air like the ticking of the clocks around them. "But first, I wish you to understand something. Time, it is a force, a constant, something we cannot control, only measure. And yet, we can shape it. We can bend it to our will." He motioned to a large cloth-covered table in the center of the room, its presence looming larger than any object should. "Come, my friends, gather around. Let me show you the culmination of a lifetime's work." The guests hesitated for a moment, but the magnetic pull of Samuel Hargrave's words was impossible to ignore. They moved toward the table, each with a look of curiosity, some with barely concealed envy. As they gathered around the table, Samuel placed his hands gently on the cloth, his fingers lingering on the edges as if reluctant to reveal what lay beneath. He turned to face his guests, and there was a flicker of something, an almost imperceptible shadow in his eyes. "It is said that time is a master," he continued, "but we must never forget, my friends, that the master is often ruled by the hands of those who understand it best. I have spent years perfecting this creation. It is not merely a clock. It is a revolution." With a flourish, he yanked the cloth away. What was revealed was, indeed, a masterpiece. A clock, but unlike any clock anyone had ever seen before. Its design was intricate, with delicate gold filigree intertwining around a dark, polished wood frame. The clock's face was not merely a traditional circular one, but a series of interlocking gears and moving parts, each piece ticking in perfect harmony. The hands were made of a dark metal, reflecting light in a way that made them almost seem alive. It was a clock that seemed to embody both the past and the future, a clock that was both antique and futuristic at the same time. "Behold," Samuel said, a small smile curling at the edges of his lips, "the eternal timepiece." For a moment, there was a hushed silence as the guests examined the creation before them. They knew they were looking at something extraordinary, but the tension in the air was thickening. The air was charged with an odd mix of awe and discomfort. The clock seemed to hold something more than just the passage of time. There was a palpable unease in the room, as if the clock was a symbol of something darker, something that none of them fully understood. As the group continued to admire the clock, one thing was certain: Samuel Hargrave's unveiling had brought them together in a way that was undeniable. But what they did not know, what none of them could have predicted, was that this gathering would soon become the scene of a crime far more devastating than any of them could have imagined. It was exactly 12 o'clock when the first sign of trouble began. The sound of the clock's ticking seemed to grow louder, somehow, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Samuel Hargrave stood proudly before his guests, the soft glow of the fire dancing in his sharp eyes. The clock, or rather, his clock, gleamed before them, each tiny piece of brass and polished wood seeming to shimmer with its own secret. The air was heavy, laden with expectation, but also, it seemed, with an invisible weight. The guests stood around the timepiece, each inspecting it with varying degrees of admiration, yet their movements were all strangely slow, hesitant, cautious. No one had yet spoken, save for a few murmurs of astonishment at the sheer technical beauty of the creation. And then, from the edge of the room, there was a soft cry. Veronica Hargrave, Samuel's niece, had taken a step back from the table, her pale face blanching as she clutched her hands to her chest. The other guests turned quickly toward her, startled by her sudden outburst. "My God! Uncle, no!" Veronica's voice, once steady, cracked under the weight of her words. She staggered backwards, her breath quickening, and a shiver seemed to run through the entire room. The others rushed forward, but before anyone could reach her, the clockmaker collapsed. Samuel Hargrave's body hit the floor with a sickening thud, his face a terrible mask of agony, blood trickling from his mouth in thin, uneven rivulets. His left hand, still outstretched toward the clock, spasmed once, then fell limply to his side. The once proud man, the creator of perfection, lay motionless in front of them. The room erupted into chaos. Veronica's scream cut through the air. "Uncle! No!" she shrieked, falling to her knees beside him. Her hands shook as they hovered over his lifeless body, but she did not touch him. She seemed almost frozen in place, her face the picture of terror. Tommy Hayes, who had been standing closest, was the first to react. His face turned a ghostly shade of white as he dropped to his knees next to her, checking for any signs of life. But it was too late. Samuel Hargrave was dead. "We must call for help," Edward Forsyth, the historian, said, his voice trembling. He was already hurrying toward the door, nearly knocking over a chair in his haste. "Someone, get the constable." But Martin Blake, the financier, remained eerily still, his expression unreadable. He gazed down at Samuel's lifeless form with an air of calm detachment, as if taking in a particularly unfortunate event rather than a tragedy. "This is no accident," he muttered under his breath, barely audible. "No, this is no accident at all." The room was now filled with the panicked sounds of footsteps, voices rising in concern and confusion, but Poirot remained outside the chaos, his mind already clicking into motion. It was not until the constable had arrived and the guests had been herded into the drawing room that Poirot's attention shifted fully. He had not been far from the manor, having stayed at a local inn for the past few days. When word had reached him that something had gone wrong at Dunsford House, he had come immediately, as any good detective would do. The constable, a young man whose hands shook as he scribbled down the details, looked to Poirot for guidance. "Sir, we don't know what happened." There was no sign of struggle, no obvious injury. "Only blood," he said, his voice faltering. "The gentleman, Samuel Hargrave, he just collapsed. One moment, he was standing, the next." Poirot raised a hand, silencing the constable. His mind was already working, observing, calculating. He scanned the room, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The guests were seated on the plush chairs, their faces pale with shock, and their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and curiosity. They all stared at Samuel's body as if he were an object rather than a person. Hercule Poirot took in the scene, his thoughts already forming. The obvious question was, what had caused Samuel Hargrave's death? The answer was not clear, but Poirot knew that it would not be found in the obvious. It never was. He cleared his throat, his voice soft but firm. "Mon cher constable, it is clear that Samuel Hargrave did not die of natural causes. This is no mere fainting spell. Someone in this room has murdered him." The constable looked at Poirot with wide eyes. "Murdered?" Poirot nodded, his gaze sweeping over the assembled guests, each one now looking at him with varying degrees of unease. He could feel their eyes on him, watching him, waiting for him to say something. But Poirot knew better than to give them the satisfaction. His mind was already unraveling the puzzle, and he could see the beginning threads of a larger, more intricate web. "I shall need to speak with each of you," Poirot continued, his tone as polite as ever, though the force of his words hung heavy in the air. "Please, sit. We must be calm. We must be precise." The constable, though nervous, gestured for everyone to sit. Poirot's eyes remained cold and calculating as they slowly gathered themselves into the chairs. They had no idea, of course, what was about to unfold. As Poirot looked at each of them, his mind was already piecing together the smallest details. The shocked faces, the varying degrees of distress, the way Veronica had stepped away from the clock just before the event, all of it meant something. The timing, the blood, the strange absence of any obvious injury. It pointed to something far more sinister than anyone had yet realized. The constable left to investigate further, but Poirot remained in the room, his thoughts focused. He had begun to see the faintest traces of a pattern, one that no one else had yet observed. But one thing was clear: this murder, as shocking as it seemed, was not random. Samuel Hargrave had been killed for a reason, and it was only a matter of time before Poirot revealed what that reason was. The chill of the autumn afternoon had seeped into the very bones of Dunsford House by the time Hercule Poirot arrived. His polished black shoes clicked sharply against the stone steps as he entered the grand manor, his small frame dwarfed by the looming walls of the ancient house. His mustache, perfectly groomed as ever, twitched slightly in the draught, but his eyes, sharp and analytical, moved with purpose. He did not linger on the opulence of the house, nor on the unsettling silence that had descended like a heavy fog. His mind was already working, and every small detail mattered. Inside, the drawing room had become an uneasy waiting area. The guests, still in various stages of shock, had gathered near the window, eyes darting toward the open door, waiting for answers, and perhaps hoping for a moment's peace. But there was no peace for them now. The stillness that had settled into the air felt like a pressure, like the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. Poirot entered without fanfare, and the room seemed to exhale, the weight of his presence immediately changing the atmosphere. His gaze passed over the group, the guests, their eyes wide and full of unspoken emotions. The constable, still fumbling with his notepad, stood awkwardly by the door, unsure of how to proceed. Poirot's sharp eyes locked onto him. "I have come to offer my assistance," Poirot said, his voice soft, but it cut through the room like a knife through butter. "It seems that Monsieur Hargrave's unfortunate demise was no mere accident. But rest assured, we will uncover the truth." The constable, startled by Poirot's assuredness, nodded quickly. "I'm glad you've arrived, Monsieur Poirot. We didn't know where to begin." Poirot waved a hand dismissively, as though the constable's words were of no consequence. He turned his gaze to the group of guests. "It is simple, is it not?" Poirot's eyes glinted as he spoke. "You are all here because of your connection to Samuel Hargrave. But now, my friends, we are all part of a different connection, the connection of murder." A silence filled the room, broken only by the low ticking of the clocks. Poirot's eyes swept across the guests again, methodical, calculating. "Let us begin," he continued. "But first, tell me, where was each of you when Monsieur Hargrave fell?" The room stiffened. It was as though the question itself made them realize they were now suspects in the same crime. Veronica Hargrave, who had been standing near the window, let out a sharp breath and approached Poirot. Her hands trembled slightly as she folded them in front of her. Her eyes, though red from earlier tears, still held a sharpness that intrigued Poirot. I was standing beside the clock. I saw him collapse in front of me," she said, her voice low. "It was so sudden. He was fine one moment, and the next he was gone." Poirot nodded as he studied her carefully. "And you, madam, did you notice anything unusual just before this tragedy? Perhaps something with the clock? A strange sound? A movement?" Veronica hesitated, glancing down at the polished floor. "No, nothing unusual. Just the clock. But I saw him, Uncle Samuel, reach out for it, as if he were trying to steady himself. He touched the clock and then fell." Poirot's brow furrowed slightly. It was the tiniest hint, but it could not be overlooked. Hargrave had touched the clock before collapsing. It seemed innocent enough, but Poirot knew that nothing was ever truly innocent in such matters. "Très bien," Poirot said, nodding thoughtfully. "We shall revisit that moment." Turning his attention to the others, he focused next on Edward Forsyth, the historian. Forsyth had been pacing nervously near the fireplace, his face pale and furrowed as though the weight of his thoughts had grown too heavy to bear. "Monsieur Forsyth," Poirot said, his voice gentle but precise, "you, too, were near the clock." Forsyth stiffened and turned to face Poirot, his jaw tightening. Yes, I was. But I didn't see anything before he collapsed. I'm no doctor. All I can say is I heard a strange sound, a kind of creak. A deep, almost mechanical sound. Poirot's eyes narrowed. A mechanical sound, you say? Yes, just before he fell. It could have been the clock. I thought it was just a sound from one of the gears inside it. But then Hargrave went down. Poirot gave him a small nod of acknowledgement, but his mind was already turning over the implications. A creak, a mechanical sound. Was it possible that the clock, in some way, played a role in the murder? Turning now to Tommy Hayes, Poirot observed the assistant carefully. Tommy had been quiet until now, his eyes darting nervously around the room. His usual cheerfulness was gone, replaced by a jittery unease that made Poirot more suspicious than ever. "Monsieur Hayes," Poirot began, his voice even but pointed, "you were closest to Monsieur Hargrave when he fell. Did you notice anything?" Tommy fidgeted with the cuffs of his jacket, avoiding eye contact. I didn't see much, to be honest. I was looking at the clock, like the others. I was admiring it. Then he just collapsed. It was as if he couldn't breathe. I tried to check on him, but he swallowed hard. I don't know what happened. It was all too fast. Poirot's sharp gaze flicked toward Martin Blake, who had remained unusually silent through the questioning. Blake had been standing at the far end of the room, his arms folded across his chest, his posture calm, almost too calm. "And you, Monsieur Blake?" Poirot asked, his tone now firm. "What did you observe?" Blake regarded Poirot with a measured look, his eyes betraying nothing. "I observed the same as everyone else, I suppose. I saw the man collapse. It was a tragic accident, surely." Poirot tilted his head slightly, studying the financier. "An accident," he repeated softly. "Or something else, perhaps. Something more deliberate." Blake's gaze flickered for the briefest moment, but then he smiled, a thin, calculated smile. "I think we are all overthinking this, Poirot. The man was old. It could have been a heart attack. Or maybe a sudden stroke." Poirot considered this. Yes, it was a plausible explanation, one that many would settle for. But Poirot was not one for easy answers. And the moment he heard Blake's words, he knew that this was more than just an accident. Poirot glanced once more around the room, his mind already racing through the possibilities, the discrepancies, the subtle contradictions that only someone with his mind could perceive. But he knew one thing for certain. Someone in this room had killed Samuel Hargrave. And the key to solving this murder lay in the clockmaker's own creation. The guests remained seated, the tension in the room thicker than the fog outside. Poirot had carefully observed each one of them as they spoke, taking note of their expressions, their movements, the slight hesitations in their voices. Everything, he knew, mattered. The smallest detail could provide the crucial piece of the puzzle. With the formal introductions behind him, Poirot set to work with his methodical precision. His sharp eyes turned to the constable, who was now standing awkwardly by the door, a notepad in hand. "Monsieur Constable," Poirot began, his voice calm but assertive, "I need you to secure the area. No one is to leave this house, no matter the hour. We are not yet finished here." The constable nodded, his face a mask of uncertainty. "Of course, Monsieur Poirot. You have my word." Poirot turned to the group once more, his gaze sweeping over them like a master chess player contemplating his next move. He knew that the crime was one of subtlety, one that required patience, precision, and an understanding of human nature. His task was not merely to uncover the how, but the why. Why had Samuel Hargrave been murdered, and who among them was willing to commit such an act? He began with the basics, the alibis, the chronology of events, the minor details that no one else would consider. "Madame Veronica," Poirot said, his voice smooth but insistent, "you were standing by the clock when Monsieur Hargrave collapsed. Did you notice anything unusual about him? Anything that seemed out of place? A change in his demeanor?" Veronica, who had been sitting rigidly in her chair, now looked up at him with eyes that seemed both defiant and distressed. She crossed her arms tightly, as though holding herself together. "I told you already," she said, her voice slightly sharp. "I saw him reach out for the clock. He seemed fine one moment, Then he suddenly stumbled. There was nothing else. Poirot nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. But, madam, you see, something must have triggered his fall. Something unseen, perhaps. An external force, a subtle push, or, his gaze flicked toward the clock, could it have been the very clock itself? Veronica's face tightened, and she seemed to grow even more uncomfortable at the mention of the clock. I don't understand what you mean. It's just a clock, she said, her voice growing defensive. It's no more dangerous than any other. Ah, perhaps, Poirot murmured, his tone quiet but thoughtful. But what if the clock is more than it seems? Veronica seemed about to protest further, but stopped herself, biting her lip. Poirot noticed this hesitation, and it told him far more than any words could. He turned his attention to the next person, Edward Forsyth, the historian. Forsyth had been nervously pacing the room earlier, but now he had settled into a chair, rubbing his temples as though the weight of the events had drained him. His eyes flicked up to meet Poirot's as the detective approached. Monsieur Forsyth, Poirot began, I understand you have a particular interest in the history of Dunsford House. You know the manor's secrets, the stories it holds. But tell me, what do you know about Samuel Hargrave himself? Forsyth seemed taken aback by the question. What do I know of Hargrave? He was a genius, an artist, a creator of unparalleled skill. He was obsessed with his work, perhaps. But his personal life, I couldn't say. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving Forsyth's. Perhaps not his personal life, but surely you knew his habits. Was there anything unusual about how he behaved these last days? Any sign of trouble? Any worry or fear? Forsyth hesitated. No, I don't think so, he said, his voice faltering. He was always focused. But he did mention something once, in passing, about the clock. He said it would be the last of its kind, something about it being a final creation. Forsyth's eyes clouded as if recalling the memory. It seemed odd at the time, but now, Poirot's interest peaked. A final creation, you say? What did he mean by that? Was he ill? Or did he sense something was amiss? Forsyth shook his head, clearly unsure. I don't know. He was always cryptic like that. But he said it with such finality. I thought he was simply being dramatic, as he often was. Poirot's mind spun. Hargrave's final words were telling, but what did they mean? Was he hinting at something more than just the end of his work? Was it possible that Samuel Hargrave had known something was going to happen to him? Was this murder the result of some deep-seated fear or a dark revelation? Poirot's gaze shifted to Tommy Hayes. The assistant had been quiet, too quiet. His face betrayed the unease that had been growing in the room, and Poirot noted the way his fingers tapped nervously against the arm of his chair. Monsieur Hayes, Poirot said, his voice soft but insistent. You were closer to Hargrave than anyone. His assistant, yes? You must have noticed something unusual in his behavior recently. Tommy's eyes darted about the room before he met Poirot's gaze. He shifted in his chair, his expression one of distress. I don't know what you mean, he said, his voice shaky. He was always a bit odd, you know? But he was a genius, and he trusted me. He said I was the only one who could help him with his final project. But that's all. Nothing strange, I swear. Poirot leaned in. And yet, Monsieur Hayes, you must have felt something. When you saw him collapse, did you see anything unusual? Did you notice anything about the clock, the way he fell, or the sound you mentioned earlier? Tommy swallowed hard. I didn't hear anything. Just a strange noise, like a deep click or a turn, but I thought it was the clock ticking. I didn't think much of it. And then he just collapsed. Poirot nodded slowly, taking in the details. A click, you say? It could be important. Finally, Poirot turned to Martin Blake. The financier had been unusually quiet throughout the questioning, and there was something about his calm demeanor that felt wrong. Poirot's eyes lingered on Blake for a moment longer than the others. Monsieur Blake, Poirot said, his voice cutting through the stillness of the room, you have said little so far, and yet you have a certain presence in this room. Tell me, Did you know of Hargrave's final creation? Of the clock, I mean. Blake met Poirot's gaze with a composed expression. I don't know much about clocks, Poirot. I'm a businessman, not an inventor. But Hargrave's work was important to me. He was a valuable asset. His reputation could only have added value to my interests. Poirot's eyes sharpened. Ah, business interests, he repeated. You and Monsieur Hargrave were connected in that sense? Blake's gaze tightened, but he quickly masked his discomfort with a smile. Of course. We had dealings. Nothing unusual, I assure you. Poirot didn't press further, but he made a mental note. Blake had known Hargrave in a way that wasn't just professional. There was more to their relationship than the simple exchange of money. But what had Hargrave's death cost Blake? That was the question. Poirot stood for a moment, his sharp mind taking in every detail. The small contradictions, the vague statements, the reluctance to share certain information. All of it was part of the puzzle, and he was slowly beginning to see the outline of the picture. There was still much to learn, and many questions remained unanswered. But the clock, the mysterious final creation, held the key, and Poirot was determined to uncover it. The following day, the atmosphere in Dunsford House was suffocatingly heavy, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the shock of Samuel Hargrave's death. The rain had begun to fall steadily, tapping against the windows like a soft, relentless reminder of the passage of time. The clocks, as always, ticked relentlessly in the background, marking the passing of moments with a rhythmic insistence. But for those in the house, time felt suspended, as though they were trapped in the limbo of an unresolved mystery. Poirot had spent the night poring over every detail, his mind weaving through the layers of lies and contradictions like a fine thread through cloth. Every word, every gesture, every hesitation from the guests had been noted. But there was still much to uncover, and Poirot knew that it was time to begin applying subtle pressure. The constable had secured the manor as Poirot had requested, and no one was allowed to leave until the truth was revealed. The guests had all returned to the drawing room, looking uncomfortable, uneasy, and anxious, their faces still marked by the shock of the previous day. They were waiting for Poirot to take charge, to offer them some direction. But he remained as calm and composed as ever, his piercing gaze taking in everything and everyone. As Poirot entered the room, the guests all turned toward him, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. He surveyed them silently for a moment, letting the tension linger before speaking. My friends, Poirot began, his voice calm but firm, I have spent the night considering what you have all told me. There are many pieces to this puzzle, and yet, I believe I have begun to see the shape of it. However, we must now explore every possibility. There is no room for assumption, only for facts. He paused, watching their faces carefully. No one spoke, but the tension in the room thickened. Poirot's eyes landed on Martin Blake, who had been unusually quiet during the previous conversations. Blake was the financier, the man who had seemed so composed and distant. And yet, Poirot suspected there was something more to his calm exterior. Monsieur Blake, Poirot said, his voice carrying a quiet intensity, you have not given me many details. You have been quick to dismiss the idea of foul play, but I must ask you this. Why did you so eagerly suggest that Samuel Hargrave's death was natural? Did you not find it odd, monsieur, that such a sudden death would be classified so hastily? Blake's gaze flickered, a brief moment of unease flashing across his face before he composed himself. As I said, Poirot, I'm a businessman. My interests are practical. Hargrave was not young. His health had been deteriorating for some time. It didn't seem unreasonable to think that his death could have been due to natural causes. Poirot raised an eyebrow. Natural causes, he repeated slowly. Perhaps, Monsieur Blake. But tell me, why do you appear so eager to dismiss the possibility of foul play? Blake's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. The moment stretched between them, and Poirot could sense that Blake was hiding something, perhaps an interest in the estate, or some personal reason to see Hargrave's death classified as a mere accident. But Poirot knew better than to press too quickly. The truth would come in time. Poirot turned his attention to the others, his mind already considering the possibility of red herrings, false clues deliberately planted to mislead him. Edward Forsyth, the historian, had mentioned a strange creak from the clock just before Hargrave collapsed. This had intrigued Poirot, as it suggested that the clock itself may have played a role in the death. But was it simply a coincidence, or was the clock a carefully crafted piece of misdirection? Poirot knew that in a case like this, nothing was ever as it seemed. The idea that the clock had been tampered with was certainly a possibility, but Poirot was careful not to draw conclusions prematurely. He needed to find the key, the motive that would unravel the mystery. "Now, let us talk of the clock itself," Poirot continued, his eyes flicking between the guests. "It is clear that Monsieur Hargrave's final creation was at the heart of this tragedy. The clock, after all, was not just an ordinary timepiece. It was his masterpiece, his obsession. But the question remains, why did he choose to display it before his death? Was it merely pride in his work, or was there something else at play?" Veronica Hargrave, who had been sitting with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, looked up at Poirot, her eyes filled with a mixture of grief and uncertainty. "Uncle Samuel, he was always obsessed with perfection," she said softly. "He spent so many years working on that clock. He would often speak of it as his final creation, his legacy. But I don't think he knew that it would be his last." Poirot nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Yes, but was there more to it? A warning, perhaps? Was the clock linked to something darker, something hidden?" Veronica hesitated, her fingers twitching slightly. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I do know that he was worried. He was always worried about something, but he never told me what it was. He was secretive, even with me. I think he had enemies, though I never knew who." The word struck Poirot with the force of an epiphany. Enemies. The idea of a man with enemies, keeping secrets, made sense. Samuel Hargrave was a man of great talent, but also a man who had spent his life creating something that few could understand. It was not a stretch to imagine that he might have made some powerful enemies over the years. Poirot turned to Forsyth again. The historian, as expected, had become more and more agitated with each passing moment. He seemed to shift uncomfortably in his chair, his eyes darting nervously from Poirot to the others. "Monsieur Forsyth," Poirot began, his voice gentle but probing, "you mentioned a strange sound from the clock before Hargrave collapsed. A click or a creak, if I recall correctly. Could it be that the clock had been tampered with? Was it possible that someone used the clock to kill him?" Forsyth's face went pale. He fidgeted with his glasses, avoiding Poirot's gaze. I don't know. It was just a sound. It could have been nothing. Perhaps it was just the gears settling. The clock is old, you know. It's been in the family for generations." "But you heard it, Monsieur Forsyth. It was not just the wind, was it?" Poirot pressed. "It was a distinct noise. Something out of place. The clock was not as it seemed." Forsyth swallowed hard. I don't know. Maybe. I don't want to be involved in this. I've already told you everything I know." Poirot's eyes softened, though his mind raced. It was becoming clear that Forsyth's nervousness was not simply fear. He was hiding something, perhaps too terrified to reveal it. But what? And why? Was he afraid of implicating himself, or was there someone else he feared? The clues were there, but they were wrapped in layers of confusion and misdirection. The clock, the mysterious sound, the strange behavior of the guests, it was all leading Poirot toward something, but what? Poirot paused, his gaze lingering on each of the guests. The red herrings were numerous, false leads designed to throw him off the scent. But Poirot was never fooled by distractions. He knew that in order to find the truth, he had to cut through the lies, one by one. "The game is afoot," Poirot said quietly, almost to himself. "We are not finished yet. But I shall find the truth, no matter how deep the deception runs." And with that, Poirot began his next round of questioning, carefully moving forward, step by step, toward the final revelation. The rain had not ceased, and the house remained cloaked in an oppressive stillness, broken only by the incessant ticking of the clocks, each one, it seemed, mocking the helplessness of the guests as the minutes dragged by. Poirot sat in his usual seat, a small chair near the fireplace, as he surveyed the room. The guests were restless, shifting in their seats, exchanging glances, their discomfort palpable. But Poirot, ever the picture of calm, was not moved. He had always known that the smallest detail, the most overlooked moment, was often the key to solving a case. Today, He had noticed something that no one else had observed. A detail so minute, so easily overlooked, that it might have slipped past anyone not trained to see it. It was in the corner of the room, just beneath the mantelpiece, partially obscured by a heavy curtain. There, in the shadows, was an object that should not have been there, an object that might very well have been the link he needed. Poirot stood and approached the object, his steps deliberate and measured. The guests watched him closely, their eyes following his every move. They had long since stopped questioning him. They were now merely waiting for him to do the impossible and reveal the truth. The object was a small silver key, no larger than a matchstick, with intricate engravings running along its shaft. It was placed haphazardly, as though it had been dropped carelessly and forgotten. A key to what? Poirot wondered. It was certainly not part of the display Hargrave had been so proud of, and it was far too small to belong to any of the locks in the house. Poirot picked it up carefully, examining it closely. His fingers ran along its surface, feeling the smoothness of the metal, the sharp lines of the engraving. The key was old, but not ancient. It was made with precision, as though it had been crafted for a specific purpose. His eyes narrowed as he turned it over in his hand. A key like this would not be used for an ordinary door. It was a key to something more personal, something that had been hidden. Poirot turned to the guests, his voice cutting through the tension. "Who among you recognizes this key?" The room went silent. Everyone looked at each other in confusion, their eyes darting about in uncertainty. No one spoke. "Monsieur Forsyth," Poirot said, his gaze fixed on the historian, "you seem to know the house well. Do you recognize this key?" Forsyth's face paled. He swallowed hard, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "No, I don't. I've never seen it before." Poirot gave him a small smile, one that barely touched his lips but carried a weight of knowing. "Are you certain, Monsieur Forsyth? You know this house so well. Could it not be a key to one of the hidden rooms, perhaps? Something Mr. Hargrave might have kept from you?" Forsyth shifted uncomfortably, his eyes flicking to the other guests before returning to Poirot's piercing gaze. "I don't know what you mean. There are no hidden rooms in this house." Poirot didn't press him further. He turned to the others, his eyes lingering on each one. "Madame Veronica, Monsieur Hayes, Monsieur Blake." Veronica's eyes widened slightly, but she quickly composed herself. "I don't know what that is," she said, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. "Uncle Samuel never mentioned a key like that." Poirot turned his gaze to Tommy Hayes, who was staring at the key in something akin to shock. "Tommy," Poirot's voice was soft, but firm. "You seem troubled. Do you recognize this key?" Tommy blinked rapidly, his face a mask of confusion. I don't know. I've never seen it before." Poirot allowed the silence to stretch for a moment longer before speaking again. "This key," he said slowly, "was not left here by accident. Someone placed it in this room for a reason. It's important, and I believe it holds the key, quite literally, to the answer we are seeking." The guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The key, small and seemingly insignificant, had brought the room to an almost electric stillness. They were no longer just spectators of a crime. They were now part of the investigation. And Poirot had just exposed a crack in their facade. He turned the key over in his hand again, as though he were considering something. Then, with a quiet precision, he moved to the fireplace, his sharp eyes scanning the room one last time. His gaze finally landed on the clock that had caused so much distress the previous day. It stood, as always, in the corner, its polished brass gleaming under the dim light of the room. The sound of the ticking seemed louder now, almost oppressive. Poirot's eyes narrowed. The clock, the very thing that had captured everyone's attention, was no longer just an object of fascination. It was now an enigma, a puzzle that demanded his full attention. "Let us examine the clock," Poirot said, his voice calm but full of purpose. He moved toward the timepiece with a sense of quiet authority, his fingers grazing the cool brass. The guests watched in silence as he circled the clock, inspecting it carefully. The ticking, once so rhythmic, now seemed to echo through the room with an almost sinister energy. Poirot's eyes flicked to the key once more. He had an idea, but he needed to test it. He walked around the back of the clock, feeling along the frame with his fingers. There, just beneath the gilded face, he felt a slight indentation, a small, almost imperceptible gap that shouldn't have been there. A secret compartment, perhaps? Poirot inserted the key into the gap, and with a soft click, the back of the clock swung open. There, hidden behind the mechanism, was a small compartment, no larger than a matchbox. Poirot opened it carefully, his breath held in anticipation. Inside the compartment was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age, its edges frayed as though it had been handled many times. He unfolded it gently, his eyes scanning the words written in neat, precise handwriting. The message was brief, but it was enough to send a ripple of shock through him. For the truth to be known, the final piece must be revealed. The cryptic message sent a chill through the room. The truth? What truth? And who had written it? Was this the message Hargrave had left for someone? Had he known that his life was in danger? Had he been trying to communicate something important? Poirot turned to the guests, his eyes now hard with purpose. It seems, Miss Amos, that Monsieur Hargrave was not merely concerned with his clocks. He was preparing for something more. And I believe this message is the key to understanding what happened to him. The room was silent, the weight of the revelation settling over them like a heavy fog. No one dared speak, and Poirot knew that they were all beginning to realize the truth, that the murder of Samuel Hargrave was far more complicated than they had ever imagined. But Poirot knew one thing for certain: he was close. The final piece was within reach, and he would uncover it, no matter the cost. The discovery of the hidden compartment had sent a ripple of unease through the room, but it was far from a resolution. The message inside the clock, simple though it was, raised far more questions than it answered. The words were a riddle, and in Poirot's experience, riddles were often the final flourish before the truth was revealed, but only if one knew how to solve them. Poirot had placed the folded paper back into the compartment and closed the clock with a soft click. He returned to the center of the room, his hands folded before him in a manner that betrayed no emotion but immense concentration. The guests remained seated, their faces a study in varying degrees of discomfort. Veronica Hargrave looked pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as though trying to hold on to something solid in the midst of all this confusion. Tommy Hayes, as always, was fidgeting with his hands, his eyes darting nervously from one person to the next. Forsyth, the historian, was trying to maintain his composure, but the slight tremor in his fingers betrayed his anxiety. Only Martin Blake seemed unaffected, though his silence, too, spoke volumes. Poirot knew that now, more than ever, the truth was within reach. The clock, Hargrave's final creation, was not just a work of art, it had been the tool for hiding something far more significant. But what was it? And who had the motive to destroy the creator? Miss Amos, Poirot began, his voice steady but carrying an underlying weight of finality, we are moving closer to the truth. But there are still many things that have not been said. Secrets, lies, hidden motives that no one has yet admitted. It is time that we uncover them. He turned his gaze to Forsyth first. Monsieur Forsyth, you have said that you knew the house well, that you spent much time here, studying its history, its secrets. But, my friend, I sense that there is something you are not telling us. You were more than just a historian. You knew something about Hargrave's dealings, something you have yet to share with us. Forsyth stiffened, his hand gripping the arm of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I don't know what you mean, he said, his voice a little too forceful. I've told you everything about the house. Poirot's eyes never left Forsyth. Not about the house, Monsieur Forsyth, but about Hargrave. Forsyth's expression faltered, and Poirot's sharp gaze noticed the subtle change. The historian's breath quickened, and for the first time, he looked unsure of himself. I don't know what you're implying. Samuel Hargrave was a brilliant man. He trusted me with the history of this place, but I had no part in his personal affairs. Poirot took a step forward, his voice still soft but filled with the weight of implication. Did you know that Monsieur Hargrave was in financial trouble, Monsieur Forsyth? That he was close to losing the manor? Perhaps this clock was his last attempt to sell something of value, to secure his future. Forsyth's face grew pale, but he did not respond immediately. His eyes darted to the others, seeking refuge in their silence. But none came. He could no longer avoid Poirot's gaze. "Yes," he said quietly. Hargrave was in debt. He had invested much of his money in his clocks. But he was also trying to sell some of them, in particular the last one. The one you've all seen. Poirot nodded. "And did you know, Monsieur Forsyth, that Hargrave was not just selling his clocks to any collector, but to someone who could make him disappear? To someone who could ensure that his debts were erased?" Forsyth's eyes widened, and for a brief moment, he looked as though he were about to speak, but then he stopped himself, clamping his mouth shut. Poirot did not wait for him to speak. He turned his attention to Tommy Hayes. "Monsieur Hayes, you worked closely with Hargrave. But I have been wondering, you see, about your relationship with him. You said, just yesterday, that you were the only one who could help him with his final project. Tell me, what did you mean by that?" Tommy looked panicked, his eyes shifting uncomfortably. I didn't mean anything by it. I just helped him with the mechanical parts, you know? He'd be lost without me. But I didn't know anything about his debts, about the clock. He never said anything about it to me. Poirot's gaze remained fixed on Tommy, his expression unwavering. "Is that so, Monsieur Hayes? Or were you simply too close to notice?" Tommy looked away, swallowing hard. "I didn't know about the debts. I swear." Poirot's sharp eyes swept across the room, and he could see the fear in Tommy's face. The young man was hiding something, but Poirot had no proof yet. The shifting, the avoidance of the question, the hesitation, they were all pieces of a puzzle, but one that would require more time to complete. Poirot turned to Veronica next. "Madame Veronica, you were Samuel Hargrave's niece. Surely, you must have known something of his affairs? His financial troubles, his relationships? Surely, someone as close to him as you would know if he was making deals behind closed doors." Veronica's hands trembled as she clasped them together, her eyes darting nervously. I didn't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He never told me about any debts. He never said anything about selling the clocks. I thought he was just obsessed with his work, not with money." Poirot's eyes softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. "Madam, it is not just money that drives people to commit desperate acts. It is fear. Fear of losing everything. Fear of being alone. And, in the case of your uncle, fear of failure." Veronica flinched, her breath catching in her throat. Poirot could see that the truth was dawning on her, though she was still unwilling to admit it. Poirot's gaze finally shifted to Martin Blake. The financier had remained silent throughout the questioning, his face a mask of controlled calm. But Poirot had noticed the subtle shifts in his posture, the way his jaw tightened when the mention of debts had come up. "Monsieur Blake," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the tension in the room, "I am curious. You have been unusually quiet, yet I sense that you know more than you've let on. Hargrave was a man of reputation. A man whose financial troubles might have been of particular interest to someone like you. I wonder, Monsieur Blake, what role you played in all of this." Blake's eyes narrowed, and he finally spoke, his voice measured and deliberate. "I don't know what you're insinuating, Poirot. Hargrave and I were not close. I was interested in his work, but that was all." Poirot smiled thinly. "Ah, you were interested in his work, but perhaps more interested in his assets. His reputation. His clock, perhaps, was worth more than just its craftsmanship. Wasn't it, Monsieur Blake?" Blake stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I have no time for your insinuations, Poirot. I told you before, it was a simple business transaction. Hargrave's clocks were valuable, yes. But that doesn't mean I had anything to do with his death." Poirot remained calm, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "The truth, Monsieur Blake, is always more complex than that. We shall see, soon enough." The room fell into an uneasy silence once more. Poirot could feel the weight of the moment bearing down on them all. The lies were beginning to surface, one by one, and the picture was slowly becoming clearer. The question now was not whether Samuel Hargrave had been murdered, but who had killed him, and why. The air in Dunsford House seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment, the guests more strained as Poirot's questioning wore on. The storm outside had intensified, with thunder rumbling ominously in the distance, the rain lashing against the windows like a warning. The clocks, as ever, ticked on relentlessly, their steady rhythm at odds with the tension in the room. Yet, Poirot remained undisturbed, his sharp eyes carefully scanning his guests, as though each small shift in posture or movement revealed a deeper truth. The false bravado of Martin Blake, the shifting discomfort of Tommy Hayes, and the faltering nerves of Forsyth, all of them were beginning to break down. And now, it was time for the final part of the puzzle to fall into place. Poirot knew that he needed to push further, but he also knew that it would take more than just logic to crack the case. He needed to break the guests. He needed them to face the reality of their own actions, to expose the secrets they had buried deep inside themselves. Poirot chose his next target carefully. "Madame Veronica," he began, his voice gentle, but with an underlying sharpness, "you are, perhaps, the one who has been most affected by your uncle's death. And you, too, are hiding something, are you not? Perhaps you did not know the extent of Hargrave's financial troubles, but you knew him well. Too well to believe he was the simple, obsessive man you would have us think." Veronica recoiled as though struck, her eyes wide with surprise and unease. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words did not come at first. Instead, her breath hitched, and she looked away, as though she could not bear the weight of Poirot's gaze. "You were close to him," Poirot continued, his voice soft yet firm. "Perhaps closer than you admit. I sense, madam, that there was more between you and your uncle than just family ties. Perhaps something darker." Her hands gripped the armrests of her chair tightly, her knuckles white with the effort. Veronica's lips trembled as she gathered the strength to speak. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "He was everything to me. My father. He was never there for me. It was always Uncle Samuel who looked after me, who supported me. But lately, I don't know. He became distant. He wouldn't talk to me. He stopped trusting me." Poirot leaned forward, his gaze never leaving her face. "Why did he stop trusting you, madam? What had changed?" Veronica's eyes filled with tears, but she wiped them away quickly, almost angrily. "He was afraid," she said, her voice breaking. "He was afraid of losing everything, his reputation, his work, his life. He became obsessed with that clock, with the idea of leaving something behind that would make him remembered. He became obsessive. And then, one night, he told me something that frightened me." She paused, as if gathering herself. "He said he was afraid of the people he'd been dealing with, that someone would come after him." Poirot's eyes widened slightly, but he did not interrupt. He could see that Veronica was on the edge, but the truth was still buried beneath layers of grief and fear. He waited. Veronica continued, her voice now a whisper. "He told me that there were people who would stop at nothing to get their hands on the clock. That if they didn't get it, they'd make sure he didn't live long enough to finish it." The revelation hung in the air, heavy and dark. Poirot's mind raced. He had suspected that Hargrave's death was not just about personal turmoil. The mention of people who would harm Hargrave, this was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. Someone had been after the clock, and Samuel Hargrave had been too close to his own creation to see the danger. Poirot turned slowly, his eyes now scanning the rest of the group. He could see the impact of Veronica's words on each of them. Forsyth shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenched in his lap. Tommy Hayes looked as if he wanted to be anywhere but here. But it was Blake who stood out. His face had grown taut, his lips thinning with an emotion that was not entirely controlled. Poirot took a step back, his mind piecing together the fragments of this newfound truth. He had suspected the involvement of someone outside the circle of family and friends, but now it seemed there were deeper layers of conspiracy, of hidden forces at play. "Tell me, Monsieur Blake," Poirot said, his voice calm but full of the weight of the revelation. "Did you too know about these people? Did you know that Samuel Hargrave was being threatened? Did you know about the dangers he was facing?" Blake stiffened, his jaw tightening. He stared at Poirot, his face betraying the slightest flicker of panic. "I don't know what you mean," he replied, his voice too steady, too practiced. "I had no idea what Hargrave was involved with." Poirot didn't move, his gaze locked on Blake. "So you claim, Monsieur Blake. But you were the one who expressed little surprise when Hargrave's death was suggested to be natural. You were the one who showed no shock when it was clear that this was a man who had enemies. Tell me, monsieur, what was your involvement with these people your niece speaks of?" Blake's hand tightened into a fist. "I told you before, Poirot, I had nothing to do with Hargrave's death. I had no reason to harm him." Poirot's gaze never wavered. "But Monsieur Blake, it seems that you did have something to gain from his death. Hargrave was drowning in debts, and you were the one who stood to profit from the sale of his clock, were you not? You may not have been directly involved with those who threatened him, but you had access to him. And that, my friend, is enough." The room fell into a tense silence. Poirot's words echoed in the stillness, hanging in the air like the calm before a storm. Blake's facade was beginning to crack, and Poirot could see the inner turmoil behind his calm exterior. "I didn't kill him," Blake said, his voice hoarse now. "But I might as well have. He refused to sell the clock. He was going to give it to some private buyer, someone who promised him more than I ever could. I needed that clock. It was my ticket out of the mess I'd gotten myself into. But he wouldn't listen." Blake's voice was rising now, his words tumbling out in a rush. "So I tried to persuade him. I asked him to sell it, just one last time. But he refused. He said he wouldn't sell to me or anyone else. He was determined to finish it. And that was when I realized that if I didn't act soon, it would all be over for me." Veronica gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Tommy's face went pale, and Forsyth looked at Blake as if seeing him for the first time. Poirot's eyes narrowed. "You did more than ask him, did you not, Monsieur Blake? You threatened him, didn't you?" Blake's face twisted in agony, but he did not deny it. He simply nodded, his face contorting with guilt and fear. "Yes, I threatened him, but I didn't kill him. I just wanted him to listen. I wanted him to sell the clock, to give me what I needed. And when he wouldn't, I didn't know what to do." Poirot stepped forward, his voice steady but firm. "You knew that he was afraid. You knew he was vulnerable. You knew he was under pressure. And still, you pushed him. You forced him into a corner." Blake lowered his head, a silent admission of guilt. Poirot took one final step toward him. "And now," Poirot concluded, "you are caught in a web of your own making." The room was silent, the truth now fully exposed. The web of lies had unraveled, and the murderer had been revealed. But Poirot knew that the consequences of this discovery would ripple out far beyond the walls of Dunsford House. For Martin Blake, the clock had run out. The silence in the room was palpable, the air thick with the weight of Poirot's final revelation. Martin Blake stood motionless, his head lowered, as if the full realization of his actions had finally hit him with all the force of an avalanche. His usually controlled demeanor had cracked completely, and now he looked like a man who had been caught in his own web, tangled in lies and guilt. Veronica Hargrave, still reeling from the shock of her uncle's death, sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring at the floor. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. Forsyth, the historian, seemed almost to shrink in his chair, as though the exposure of Blake's guilt had caused the very walls to close in on him. Tommy Hayes, on the other hand, had turned his face away, unable to look directly at Blake or anyone else. It was clear that the truth had shaken him, but perhaps not as profoundly as it had affected the others. Poirot, however, remained calm, the calm in the midst of the storm. He had known from the very beginning that the solution would not come easily. But now, with Blake's confession hanging in the air, the detective had only one last step to take. He had to confront the final truth, the true motive behind Blake's actions. "It seems, Monsieur Blake," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the thick silence, "that you did, in fact, kill Samuel Hargrave. But not because you wanted the clock for its intrinsic value. No, you killed him because you wanted control. You saw an opportunity, and you took it. But your greed and desperation were your downfall." Blake's eyes flicked up at that, his face a mixture of shame and defiance. "You don't understand," he said, his voice strained. "I needed that clock. It was my last chance. I was already in too deep with my creditors. I was sinking, and Hargrave was my ticket out. But he refused to sell it. He kept saying it was a legacy, something bigger than all of us. And I couldn't let him keep it. I had to make him understand. Poirot took a deliberate step toward him, his eyes locking onto Blake's. You see, Monsieur Blake, this is where your mistake lies. You believed that the clock, or rather, control over the clock, would solve your problems. But in the end, it was the very thing that brought you down. It was not your creditors or the debt that led you to murder. It was your inability to accept that you were not in control. Blake's fists clenched, his breathing quickening. I didn't want to kill him, he protested, his voice rising. I just wanted him to sell the clock, to give it to me. I never meant for it to go this far. Of course, Poirot said, his voice soft but full of conviction. That is always the case, is it not? The murderer never intends to kill. But in your desperation, you pushed too far. You threatened him. And then, when he refused you again, you made sure he wouldn't stop you. The guests watched in silence as Poirot continued. It was not the clock that was your problem, Monsieur Blake. It was your own fear of losing control. Fear of failure. You believed that if you took control of the clock, you could rewrite your fate. But in doing so, you sealed your own. Blake's expression twisted in frustration. I didn't want to kill him, he repeated, almost as if trying to convince himself. It was just supposed to be a threat. I wanted him to listen to me. I wanted him to trust me. Poirot shook his head, his expression solemn. But the moment you made him believe that his life was at risk, Monsieur Blake, the moment you pushed him into a corner where he saw no escape, you took away his ability to choose. That is where the murder happened, in that moment of fear. Blake's eyes shifted toward Veronica, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, her face etched with grief and confusion. I never meant for you to find out like this, Blake said, his voice now quiet, almost pleading. I thought I could fix things. I thought I could make everything right again. Poirot's gaze softened as he looked toward Veronica. Madame Veronica, he said gently, you were not involved in your uncle's death, but you were part of a situation where you did not see what was happening until it was too late. Samuel Hargrave's obsession with perfection, his refusal to sell the clock, was not just about money, it was about legacy. But the truth, you see, is that legacy comes at a price. And it is often those closest to the Creator who pay the highest toll. Veronica's breath caught in her throat as she processed the weight of Poirot's words. She had never fully understood the darkness that had taken root in her uncle's mind, but now it seemed so clear. Samuel Hargrave had been trapped in his own creation. And in the end, it was that very creation that had led to his demise. Poirot turned back to Blake, his tone now resolute. Monsieur Blake, I believe you have seen the truth. You did kill Samuel Hargrave. And now, you will face the consequences of your actions. Blake's face twisted in anguish. What happens now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Poirot's answer was simple, yet final. Now, Monsieur Blake, you will answer for what you have done. The law will take its course. The guests remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts, each processing the enormity of what had been revealed. The storm outside raged on, but inside, the storm had subsided. The mystery had been solved. The truth had been uncovered. But Poirot knew that the true cost of this crime, of Blake's desperation, Hargrave's obsession, and the lies that had surrounded them all, would not be easily measured. The damage was done, and no amount of truth could undo what had been lost. As Poirot turned to leave, he paused for a moment, casting a final glance over the room. The puzzle had been completed, the pieces fitting together perfectly. But the faces before him, the shocked expressions, the guilty silence, would remain etched in his mind. There is one final thing to remember, my friends, Poirot said, his voice low but filled with quiet wisdom. Sometimes, the truth is not enough. Sometimes, it is the consequences that must be faced. And with that, he exited Dunsford House, leaving behind a group of people forever changed by the events that had unfolded within its walls. The rain had stopped, though the clouds still lingered, heavy and gray, hanging low over Dunsford House as though they, too, were reluctant to part from the unsettling events that had taken place within its walls. The guests had been escorted to their rooms, their minds weighed down with the revelations of the past few days, but their lives, for better or worse, would never be the same. Poirot stood at the window of his small, quiet study in Dunsford House, gazing out at the once majestic grounds. The autumn chill had receded, but an unsettling warmth still hung in the air, a reminder of the storm that had raged within the house, the storm of fear, guilt, and truth. It was over now. The case had been solved. The murderer had been revealed. But the detective knew that, in some ways, this was not the end. The full weight of the situation was pressing on him as he thought back over the days of questioning, the careful observations, the psychological tactics that had gradually peeled away the layers of deception. Martin Blake had confessed to killing Samuel Hargrave, but it had been the why of it that truly made this case extraordinary. The murder had not been a crime of passion, nor one of deliberate malice. It had been driven by desperation, by a fear of failure, and by the belief that control over the clock, Hargrave's final greatest creation, would provide Blake with a way out. Yet, in his pursuit of control, he had lost everything. The clock, the one object that had seemed to promise immortality for its creator, had instead sealed his fate. The legacy of Samuel Hargrave, his obsession with perfection, had led him to push away those closest to him, isolating himself in his work, and in the end, it was that isolation that led to his tragic end. Poirot let out a soft sigh and turned away from the window. The case was solved. But for some, it would never truly be over. He walked back to the drawing room where the others had been gathered. The tension had dissolved, but it had not evaporated entirely. There was an unspoken understanding between them all now, a quiet acknowledgement that the truth had come at great cost. Veronica Hargrave was sitting by the fire, her eyes distant, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She looked up as Poirot entered, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and grief. "Monsieur Poirot," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper, "thank you for uncovering the truth." Poirot nodded, though there was no triumph in his expression. "The truth, madam, was never difficult to find. What matters now is how you and the others will move forward. The clock, the death of your uncle, these are things you cannot undo. But you can choose how to respond." Veronica's lips trembled, but she remained silent, lost in her thoughts. The weight of her uncle's death, the burden of knowing the truth about his final days, was more than she could bear. Poirot's eyes softened. "There is nothing to forgive, madam. Monsieur Hargrave made his choices, just as Monsieur Blake made his. But remember, it is not the past we must regret. It is the future we must shape." He turned away from her, his gaze settling on Forsyth, who had remained in the corner, still deep in thought. Forsyth had been a part of this mystery from the beginning, but his role had been less clear. The historian had been more of an observer, a bystander in the drama that had played out in Dunsford House. But now, with the truth revealed, Poirot knew that Forsyth, too, would have to come to terms with what had happened. "Monsieur Forsyth," Poirot said, his voice gentle, "you knew this house well, yes? But it seems you did not know the man who lived here quite as well as you thought. Samuel Hargrave's legacy was not just in his clocks, but in his actions, in the choices he made. You too must come to terms with that." Forsyth looked up at Poirot, his face a mixture of guilt and confusion. "I never wanted this to happen. I never thought it would go this far. I just wanted to protect the history of this place." Poirot nodded, understanding the historian's position. "But you cannot protect history by hiding from the truth, Monsieur Forsyth. History is built on honesty, on the acceptance of what has been, and the courage to face it." Forsyth's shoulders slumped, and for a moment, Poirot could see the weight of the burden he had been carrying. He had spent his life studying history, but now he faced a personal reckoning, the truth of his involvement in the events leading to Samuel Hargrave's death. Poirot finally turned to Tommy Hayes, who had been sitting near the door, his face a mask of guilt and confusion. Tommy had been Hargrave's assistant, and though he had not directly played a role in the murder, his silence and his nervousness had always suggested he was hiding something. But the truth had come to light, and now it was time for him to face the consequences. "Monsieur Hayes," Poirot said, his voice softer than it had been with the others, "you were loyal to Hargrave, yes? But sometimes, loyalty blinds us. You saw things, but you didn't act. You kept your distance, even when you knew something was wrong." Tommy looked up at Poirot, his face red, his eyes filled with shame. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I just wanted to do my job. I didn't want to get involved in the mess with the clock, with the money, with everything." Poirot's eyes softened. "Loyalty is admirable, Monsieur Hayes, but it cannot be blind. It is easy to look away when faced with the uncomfortable truths of our lives, but in the end, We are responsible for our actions. And sometimes, it is our silence that does the most harm. Tommy's head hung low, and for a moment, Poirot wondered if he had truly understood the weight of his actions. But the silence between them spoke volumes. Tommy was not the murderer, but his inaction had allowed the events to unfold. In a way, he too had played a part. Poirot glanced over his shoulder at Blake, who had been taken into custody by the constable and was now awaiting trial for his role in the murder. Blake would face justice, but for those still remaining in the house, there would be no such clean resolution. The damage had already been done. The lies, the manipulation, and the fear had taken their toll. Poirot took a deep breath and turned to face the group once more. "The case is closed," he said softly. "But remember this, my friends, the truth may be revealed, but it does not undo the past. What matters now is what you do with the knowledge you have gained." Veronica, Forsyth, Tommy, and even Blake, all of them were trapped by their choices, by the consequences of their actions. And for each of them, the future would be shaped by how they chose to live with those truths. Poirot paused by the door, his hand resting on the handle. "One last thing," he added, turning back to face them. "Do not let the clock be the last thing that defines you. For in the end, it is not time that matters. It is what you do with the time you have." And with that, Hercule Poirot stepped out into the cool autumn evening, leaving behind Dunsford House and its secrets, a place where the ticking of clocks would continue, but where the mysteries had been laid bare, their answers finally revealed. As Poirot disappeared into the evening mist, his figure fading into the shadows, the stillness of Dunsford House seemed to settle over the remaining souls within. The mystery had unraveled, the truth exposed, and justice would soon be served. But for those who had been part of this tangled web of secrets, lies, and desperation, the consequences of their choices would linger long after the final chapter had closed. Time, as Hargrave had believed, might be an unyielding force, but it was how one chose to live within its constraints that truly defined them. In the end, Poirot had not only solved the murder, but he had also reminded them all that the greatest mysteries of life often lie not in the clocks we create, but in the choices we make. If you've enjoyed this thrilling journey into mystery and intrigue, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on all our latest stories and investigations. Join us for more suspenseful tales, clever twists, and unforgettable characters. Click the subscribe button and never miss a moment of mystery. The next case could be just around the corner.